Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Garage with Bonesaw. This time around we'll be taking a look at the German Tier 3 premium medium tank, the Panzerkampfwagen S35 739F. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that this thing doesn't look very German, and that's because it's not. This is one of the captured French tanks that was in the German tech tree from the start of the release of World of Tanks. It's the only one that actually remains in the tech tree and available in the store. The other two, the Panzer B2 and the Panzer H35, were both removed from the German tech tree with the release of the French tech tree because they're now in the French tech tree in the form of the Hotchkiss H35 and the Char B1. So the S35 is the only one that really remains in the German tech tree. And it's actually the Saumur S35 cavalry tank, which was produced in 1935 for the French army. Originally it was produced for the infantry, but the infantry hated it. They thought its cross-country performance was inadequate and that its suspension was too maintenance intensive, so they rejected it. However, the cavalry quite liked it because it had good road speed and it was actually quite effective at moving long distances quite quickly. And so they accepted it into service, and overall it was a pretty good tank. They did see action in the opening of World War II in the engagements between the French and the Germans, where they acquitted themselves quite well because they were quite well armoured, with about 35 millimeters of hull armour, with good slopes. It was cast armour. The hull, as you can see, is a two-part cast. The top part and then the lower section were cast and then welded together. And this provided very effective armour on a rather quick tank. It was also armed with a quite punchy 47mm gun, which was more than a match for the German tanks at the time. The real downside of these tanks was just that their suspension was built in the old style, as a lot of French tanks in the 30s were, which meant that it required a lot of maintenance, and as you can see it was quite hard to get into, being covered up by these side skirts. And the other downsides were things common to French tanks. As you can see here, this tank actually has like a hatch cut into the top of the cupola. French tanks didn't have those as standard. As you can see here, there's this weld plate at the back. On the French edition of this tank, I guess you could say, there was a hatch on it. I'll actually grab my H35 out to show you. The H35, where is it? France, Hotchkiss H35. As you can see here, the H35 has this hatch in the back. It does have what appears to be a commander's cupola on top, but there is no hatch in it. And this was a common thing for French tanks, because French tanks had one-man turret. The commander was both the commander, the loader, and the gunner. And also the radio man, depending on which tank. In the H35 he's the radio man as well. Now, you might be wondering, okay, if there's no cupola, how does the commander go heads up? How does he get better visibility in his tank? Well, he has some vision ports in this little bubble on top, I guess you could call it, which give him some limited visibility. However, the French doctrine was that if the commander wanted to get a better view of his surroundings, what he would do is he would open this rear hatch, and that would now become a seat. He would haul himself up and essentially sit with his legs inside the turret, and then his upper torso out and around the turret, so he could see and have better visibility. The downside of that with a one-man turret, however, was that A, he's now exposed a good chunk of himself to enemy fire, and B, if he wants to acquire a target, he needs to haul himself halfway out of the turret, look around, spot the target, climb back into the turret, traverse it, hoping the target hasn't moved, of course, to get the gun on sight, load the gun, fire the gun, check for correction of shot if he can through the scope, and then rinse and repeat to fire at the target. And if the target is destroyed or disappears, he has to climb back out to acquire a new target, provided that is that he can't find any new targets through his vision ports. And that was really a colossal disadvantage for the French tanks, and really what spelled their defeat in the Battle for France, because they just couldn't keep up with the situational awareness of a German tank. Because if I compare something like, say, the Panzer 3-on-4, which obviously wasn't in France, but it uses a Panzer 4 style turret, you can see that the German tank has a three-man crew in the turret. It has a loader, a gunner, and a commander. And the commander's up here in his cupola. He has a good amount of vision blocks, but he can also just pop himself out of this hatch at the top and look around. He can spot targets for the gunner can then lay them onto the target and take the shot, and the commander can correct for fire based on where the round lands. And for the French, this was just simply impossible with their one-man turrets. And it really meant that each tank, instead of fighting in a coordinated offensive, was really just fighting their own battles, and the crew coordination was much more limited. However, in World of Tanks, we don't really have these problems, and thankfully we get to use the S35 in its German configuration, which means that the rear hatch has been welded over, and the top bubble, I guess you could call it, has been replaced with a modified version with a hatch on the top for the commander. The Germans did use a number of these for occupation duties. They also made, I believe, a couple of modifications to them, but ultimately they weren't really used that much. They didn't really see much action after 1940. In World of Tanks, they proved to be a very, very potent Tier 3 medium. It's the only medium the Germans get before Tier 4, I believe, and it doesn't really handle like a German tank. It does handle a little bit more like a Frenchie. Its traverse speed of 40 degrees is alright. It's not all that maneuverable. It only has a top speed of 37 kilometers per hour, which means it's fast enough, but no, it's not amazing. So don't try and play this thing like an American low tier medium, the M2, something like that. It's not that fast, but it makes up for it in a good amount of firepower, amongst other things. It has a good amount of hit points with 260. Engine horsepower of 220 is good enough, so it means you won't be struggling too much up hills. The hull armor, 36 millimeters on the front, seems kind of weak. However, you notice it has a lot of good sloping. Especially when angled, this armor is very, very bouncy. The only real weak points you have are around these drivers' ports, but they're really quite angled as well, so you can bounce a good amount of shots from the front. You do have some weak points in the form of this cupola, the viewports, and these crew access hatches on the sides, but realistically, you won't be struggling too much unless you face something like a British 2-pounder gun or possibly some of the stronger Tier 3 howitzers. Just something I'd like to point out, a lot of people mistake these bulges on the side for fuel tanks and try to shoot at them. They're not fuel tanks. The French weren't that stupid when they designed their tanks. They're stowage lockers. They're just for carrying tools and tents and things like that. So as far as I'm aware, they're not a hitbox. You can't actually shoot them. So don't bother trying to set one of these things on fire by shooting there. In terms of armament, this thing has a very, very potent 47mm gun. This is the same gun that a lot of other French tanks get. I believe the B1 gets it as well. Good rate of fire with 27 rounds per minute. 55mm average penetration with standard armor piercing. This thing does get matching into tier 4 and 5 games, so you might want to carry some armor piercing composite rigid. With that, you'll get about 90mm of penetration, which means you can penetrate things like KVs if you aim correctly. In addition, it does about 52 damage per shot, which is pretty good, especially at Tier 3. It only takes a few shots to take down most opponents. Has .39 accuracy, which is pretty good, and more importantly, it has the fastest aiming time of any gun in the game, with 1.1 seconds. Very fast aim time, which means you can really get your gun on bear on targets very quickly, especially if they're moving. Or if you've just come to a halt. It's also important to note that the gun depression and general arc on this tank is pretty good. The turret rotation is 41 degrees, which is quick enough, and generally speaking, you can engage on most terrain. The gun depression isn't amazing; it's enough, but don't try to really do those hill engagements, things like that, and you should be fine. Generally speaking, the best way to play this tank is to be right at the front lines. Try not to leave your flanks open, and try not to make any too large of a maneuver, because with its mediocre speed you will struggle a little bit and you can leave your flanks open to enemy shots. However, if you just try to keep yourself angled, keep that heavier front armor towards your enemy, especially your 56mm of frontal turret armor, this thing can be a very, very hard nut to crack, which can very, very quickly retaliate and destroy most enemy targets. With your good amount of penetration, things like T-18s aren't really a problem. So generally speaking, there aren't very many targets that this thing can't deal with at Tier 3. And when you get into Tier 3 match games, this thing is actually a very, very potent force. The time when you need to show some more consideration is in Tier 4 and 5 matches. You only have 330 meters of view range and 525 meters of signal range. This often means that your opponents will have a view advantage on you. They'll see you before you see them. And while you are quite a small target comparative to some of the other things, like once again I'll grab up the Panzer IV, it's about twice as big as you are, but even then you can be seen, you can be killed, so you need to try and just hang back a little bit in those higher tier games. Either outflank the enemy to make the best out of your standard AP rounds, or if you're willing to pay for it, use the premium and to get you that advantage. You can generally deal with most targets pretty well. M3 Lees, things like that, you can penetrate from the sides. You can penetrate a T-28 from virtually any angle. So this tank is quite capable at the higher tiers. You just need to make sure to play it correctly. Overall, a very, very effective Tier 3 premium. You don't see too many of them, which is somewhat disappointing, but if you buy it and play it effectively, you can run it with barely any equipment, train some good medium crews early on, and generally have a lot of fun with this tank. It's a very, very effective Tier 3 vehicle, and more than capable of holding its own and carrying a team. So here we are on Himmelsdorf in the German Tier 3 premium tank, the Panzer S35. So as you can see, it's not particularly fast for a Tier 3 medium. I'm easily getting outpaced by these American M2s, however I do have the advantage in armour and firepower. So I'm just going to move up to this corner along the 8 line here, which I generally like to engage on, and that means I can really use my 47mm gun and decent amount of armour to best effect against the enemy. However, it's getting pretty crowded already, so I'm going to try not to get in the way too much. Instead I'm going to circle around here and see if I can get some flank shots, potentially engage that artillery piece down the centre line there. We've already lost a Panzer III Asf A, but generally speaking we are in the advantage so far. Trying to get some shots on that artillery piece, but unfortunately he's moved around and I don't really have any effective fire on him at the moment. As you can see, the tank is not a weak vehicle in terms of engine horsepower. It can very easily move up this slope, and now I've positioned myself in a good hold down position to engage the enemy should they move down the centre. Trying to once again get some shots into that artillery piece, but not really having much luck with it. As you can see, the 47mm gun on the turret aims very, very rapidly. Fastest aim time in the game with 1.7 seconds, I do believe. I'm going to try and move around and cover our artillery, because as you can see we've got 2 tanks rushing down the hill. Unfortunately I don't think I'll be fast enough to save the furthest artillery piece, but I'm really going to try and get up to my max speed and warn them, try and get there as fast as I can. No, unfortunately I don't think I'll be able to get there in time. It seems that light tanks coming down. Unfortunately no, I won't be able to save our FT artillery piece, our FTBS. But I will engage this M3. Fortunately hitting him in the track, he gets a lucky penetration there against my side plate, but I'll re-angle myself and engage. It's penetrating me again. I do believe that's through the side hatch on the side of my hull. So things don't seem quite good at this stage. We are losing 5 to 9. Unfortunately I can't get around to save our FTBS, but I will come around to engage this M3, because I figure, you know, why not? We're losing, so I may as well just charge him. Alright, bouncing off his sloped front plate there. Put some shots into his turret. As you can see, he can't engage my heavier frontal armour as effectively. His low caliber gun does not have the penetration to go through my very sloped and very strong frontal armour. So we've got enemies on the cap. Just poking the corner there to check for any enemy tanks that might be trying to rush me, but I really need to get to the cap. It's climbing steadily. Unfortunately, Panzer II decided to engage me. Missed the first shot there, but I'll finish him off very easily with the second shot there. And I've really got to get my move on if I want to engage this cap here. At best, I thought I was going to be really playing a delaying action here, but things change out for the better. So as you can see, I've got a good angle on me. Unfortunately, taking a penetrating hit from that M2 medium. However, I'm backing up a little bit, poking the corner, taking him out, engaging the T-26. As you see, the effective armour of this tank is very good against low caliber vehicles. Engage the T-29, losing my track unfortunately to the T-18. I really need to take out these tank destroyers because they do have guns that can penetrate me. thankfully the T26 is blocking me off from that T18, largely protecting me. So I've picked up 3 kills in a very short space of time there, and cleared the cap. Our allies have started capping. I'm going to engage this T18, take him out for the 6th kill. That's Top Gun in just under a minute, and that's the game won. So as you can see, the Panzer S35, very, very effective tank. I'll just move on to show you the medal screen after this, and the after battle report, because this was a 6 medal game.